In the sun-kissed streets of Santa Barbara, California, Jessica Palmer lived the life that many envied. She was the perfect suburban wife, at least on the surface. Her husband, Peter, was a successful lawyer, often away for long hours at his firm. Their family home was immaculate, filled with laughter during Sunday brunches and the outward appearance of happiness. But beneath the surface, Jessica carried a deep, unspoken emptiness. Her marriage had long since drifted into a distant routine. With Peter gone more than he was home, Jessica found herself staring at the walls, feeling lonelier than she ever had before. Peter had a son from his previous marriage, William, a quiet and reserved boy who had grown into a handsome, confident man. William returned to live with them after graduating from college, and with him he brought an unexpected spark into Jessica's dull life. Her own son, Matt, was away at university, and the house that once bustled with energy now felt quieter than ever, until William came back. At first, Jessica thought of William as she always had, her stepson. A distant figure, albeit part of her family, someone who deserved love and care. But this summer was different. William had changed physically and emotionally. He was no longer the boy she had helped raise, but a man who exuded confidence in a way that captivated her more than she cared to admit. He had always been kind and respectful, but now there was something else in the way he looked at her, something she couldn't ignore. It started innocently enough. Casual conversations over breakfast, shared moments by the pool when Peter was working late. She told herself it was normal, that it was only natural to enjoy his company. But there was an electric tension in the air, one that grew with each passing day. One particular evening, Jessica found herself alone by the pool, the sun setting in warm hues of gold and pink. William joined her, towel slung over his shoulder after a swim, his wet hair tousled. He sat beside her on the lounge chair, a little too close. She felt the heat radiating off his skin, smelled the freshness of the chlorine mixed with his cologne. "Do you ever get lonely here?" William asked, his voice soft, almost probing. Jessica turned to look at him, caught off guard by the question. "Lonely?" she repeated as if it were a foreign concept. "Why would you think that?" He shrugged, his eyes locking with hers. "I don't know. Dad's always working. Matt's away. You're here by yourself a lot." The words hit her harder than she expected. The unspoken truth of her life laid bare in a single moment. She opened her mouth to deny it, but no words came out. Instead, she nodded slightly, feeling the weight of her own reality press down on her. "I guess I do," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. The air between them grew heavier, and for the first time, Jessica felt a crack in the wall she had built around herself. William shifted closer, his leg brushing against hers, and the contact sent a shock through her body. She should have moved away, should have put distance between them, but instead, she stayed, her pulse quickening. "I've noticed," William said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Jessica's heart raced. She knew where this was going and could feel the undercurrent of tension rising between them. She should stop it now before it went too far. But something inside her, something dark and thrilling, kept her rooted to the spot. "William," she began, but before she could finish, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a tentative kiss. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Jessica's mind screamed at her to stop, to push him away, to end this before it spiraled out of control. But her body betrayed her, and instead of pulling back, she kissed him back. It was soft at first, tentative and unsure, but then it deepened, and all the loneliness, the longing, the unspoken desires that had been building inside her for years poured out in that one reckless act. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless, their hearts racing. Jessica stared at him, her mind spinning with guilt and desire. This was wrong, so wrong, but at that moment it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way William looked at her, like she was the only woman in the world. "We shouldn't," she whispered, though the words lacked conviction. "I know," William replied, his hand still resting on her thigh. "But I don't want to stop." Neither did she. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and secret glances. Their affair became an unspoken agreement, both of them knowing it was dangerous, both of them powerless to stop. When Peter was home, they kept their distance, playing the roles of dutiful wife and respectful stepson. But when Peter was away, and he often was, The tension between them grew into something neither of them could resist. The guilt gnawed at Jessica, especially when she thought of Matt. Her son trusted her, believed in her. How could she betray him like this? But every time she tried to pull away, every time she told herself it had to end, William would find her, touch her, kiss her, and she would fall right back into the flames. Their relationship became an addiction. Jessica knew it couldn't last, that eventually they would be caught. But she didn't care. She lived for the moments when they could be alone, when she could feel alive again in a way she hadn't in years. But secrets like these never stayed hidden for long. One evening, when Peter was still at work and Matt was out with friends, Jessica and William found themselves alone in the kitchen after dinner. William stood close behind her as she washed the dishes, his hands resting on her hips, his lips grazing the back of her neck. Jessica's breath hitched, her heart racing as she leaned into him, momentarily forgetting everything except the feel of his body against hers. Suddenly, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Jessica froze, her heart stopping in her chest. William stepped back quickly, his face tense as Matt's voice echoed through the house. "Mom? Are you here?" Jessica's hands shook as she dried them on the towel, trying to calm her racing pulse. "In the kitchen," she called out, her voice trembling. Matt appeared in the doorway a moment later, his eyes sweeping over the scene in front of him. Jessica forced a smile, her heart still pounding in her chest. William stood a few feet away, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm home early," Matt said, his gaze flickering between the two of them. "Just thought I'd grab a bite." Jessica nodded, her voice tight. "There's food in the fridge." Matt hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at William, who avoided his gaze. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, heading toward the fridge. But Jessica could feel the suspicion hanging in the air, the way Matt had looked at them, as if he knew something was off. Her heart pounded in her chest as she exchanged a glance with William. This was getting too close. They were playing with fire, and Jessica knew it was only a matter of time before they got burned. The air in the Palmer house grew thick with tension as the days passed. Jessica tried to push down the nagging guilt that gnawed at her. But every time she saw Matt, every time he looked at her with those questioning eyes, she felt the walls closing in. She knew Matt was perceptive. It was only a matter of time before he started asking questions she couldn't answer. William, on the other hand, seemed unaffected by the danger of their situation. He was more daring, more confident with each passing day, as if he thrived on the thrill of their secret affair. He would brush against her in the hallway when Matt was just in the next room, give her a lingering glance over the dinner table when Peter was obliviously discussing his work. It was intoxicating but terrifying at the same time. One afternoon, while Peter was at work and Matt was out running errands, Jessica and William found themselves alone again. They were in the living room, the curtains drawn to shield them from the world outside. Jessica was on edge, every sound making her jump, but William seemed calm, as if nothing could touch them in this private bubble they had created. "You need to be more careful," Jessica whispered, pulling away from him as he tried to kiss her. "Matt's suspicious, I can feel it." William frowned, his hands resting on her hips. "Matt doesn't know anything," he said dismissively. "You're overthinking it." Jessica shook her head, her pulse racing. "No, William. He knows something. He's been looking at me differently, asking questions." William's expression darkened slightly, his grip on her tightening. "So what if he does? It doesn't change anything." "It changes everything," Jessica hissed, her voice rising with panic. "He's my son. If he finds out, if Peter finds out..." William's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. "Are you scared, Jess?" Jessica's heart skipped a beat. There was something unsettling in the way William looked at her now, something possessive. She hadn't noticed it before, but it was there, just beneath the surface. She pulled away from him, shaking her head. "I don't want to lose my family," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I've already gone too far." William stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "We both have." Before Jessica could respond, the sound of the front door opening startled them both. They jumped apart, the moment shattered as Matt's voice echoed through the house. "Mom, I'm home." Jessica's heart pounded in her chest, panic surging through her veins. William straightened his shirt, casting a quick glance at her before stepping back. Jessica wiped at her eyes, trying to compose herself as Matt appeared in the doorway. "Hey," Matt said, his eyes scanning the room, landing on Jessica and then on William, who stood a few feet away. His gaze lingered on his stepbrother for a moment too long, and Jessica could feel the suspicion in the air. "What's going on?" Matt asked, his voice casual but laced with something darker. "Nothing," Jessica said quickly, her voice shaky. "We were just talking." Matt raised an eyebrow, his eyes flickering between the two of them. Jessica could see the wheels turning in his mind, the questions he was too afraid to ask out loud. He lingered in the doorway for a moment longer before nodding slowly. "I see," he said, his tone unreadable. "I'm gonna head upstairs." Jessica watched as he left the room, her heart still pounding. She turned to William, her voice barely a whisper. "This needs to stop." William's face hardened, his eyes cold. "You're scared of your own son?" Jessica didn't answer. She was scared. Scared of what would happen if Matt uncovered the truth. Scared of what this affair had already cost her. The next few days were tense. Jessica tried to avoid being alone with William, sensing that things were spiraling out of control. She knew it couldn't last, that their secret was too dangerous, too fragile to keep hidden. But William wasn't backing down. He would find her in quiet moments, corner her in rooms where they were alone, always with that same intensity in his eyes. "Are you avoiding me?" William asked one evening when they found themselves alone in the kitchen. Jessica tensed, her hands trembling as she wiped down the counter. "I'm just trying to keep things normal," she said, her voice tight. "For Matt. For Peter." The tension between them was palpable, the weight of their affair pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. But before William could say anything else, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Matt appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he looked at the two of them. "Everything okay?" Matt asked, his eyes locking with Jessica's. Jessica forced a smile, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yeah, sweetie, everything's fine." But Matt didn't look convinced. He stood there for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on William, and Jessica could feel the air between them crackling with tension. Something had shifted, and she knew that Matt wasn't going to let this go. Later that night, as Jessica lay in bed next to Peter, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to come crashing down. The weight of her lies, the guilt, the fear, it was all too much. She had crossed a line and there was no turning back now. The next morning, Jessica woke to the sound of quiet murmurs in the house. Peter had already left for work, and she assumed Matt was out with friends. But as she came downstairs, she found William lounging on the couch, casually flipping through a magazine, his gaze lifting as soon as she entered the room. The tension between them was palpable, but it wasn't the kind of tension that simmered with passion alone. It carried the weight of what they both knew was wrong but couldn't stop. "We should talk," Jessica said quietly, pulling her robe tighter around her body as if it could somehow shield her from the guilt that gnawed at her. William's eyes darkened, but there was no anger there. "Talk? About what?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "This," Jessica said, gesturing between them. "It's complicated, and I'm not sure we can keep going down this road." William leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he watched her intently. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel the same guilt you do?" Jessica swallowed, suddenly feeling the room was much smaller. She had expected defensiveness or nonchalance from William, but the raw honesty in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, an understanding passing between them. This wasn't just some reckless fling anymore. It had evolved into something messier, something with real consequences. "Matt's been asking questions," she admitted softly. "He's suspicious, and he's not a child anymore. He notices things." William sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And what do you want to do about it? You want to pretend this never happened? Go back to how things were before?" "I don't know," Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. "I just know we can't keep sneaking around like this. It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." William's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "I'll give you space if that's what you want. I don't want to hurt anyone, least of all Matt." Jessica turned her back on him and headed for the kitchen, trying to process her feelings. It wasn't that she didn't care about William, she did, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing pit of guilt that grew deeper with every secret glance and stolen touch. For the next few days, Jessica threw herself into a familiar routine. She focused on her daily tasks, kept busy with social obligations, and tried to spend more time with Matt. But the sense of unease only grew as she felt William's presence in the house. It was as if every room carried a reminder of him, of the affair that lingered like a shadow over everything. Meanwhile, Matt grew more distant. He didn't voice his suspicions, but his silence was telling. Jessica could feel the tension in the air whenever they sat down for dinner or when they passed each other in the house. It was clear he knew something wasn't right, and his sharp glances at William only confirmed her worst fears. One evening, Matt came home unexpectedly early. Jessica was in the kitchen making dinner when she heard the front door open and close quietly. She expected him to greet her, but instead she heard footsteps making their way upstairs, quick and purposeful. Her heart raced as she realized he must have gone up to William's room. She followed him, her pulse quickening with each step she took up the stairs. As she reached the top, she found Matt standing outside William's door, his hand raised as if he was about to knock but hesitating. "Matt?" she called softly, making him jump slightly. He turned to her, his expression hard. "What's going on between you and William?" he asked bluntly. Jessica froze. She hadn't expected him to confront her so directly. Her mouth went dry, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice. "Don't lie to me, Mom," Matt continued, his voice tight with anger. "I've seen the way you two look at each other. You're hiding something." Jessica's heart sank. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She could see the pain in her son's eyes, the hurt and confusion that had been building for weeks. "It's not what you think," she said finally, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they sounded. Matt's jaw clenched. "Then what is it?" "Because it looks pretty damn clear from where I'm standing." Jessica swallowed hard, trying to think of a way out, but the truth was suffocating her. She couldn't lie anymore. Not to her son. "Matt, she began. But before she could finish, the door behind him opened, and William stepped out. The air between them crackled with tension as the three of them stood there, caught in a moment that felt like the point of no return. Matt's eyes shifted from his mother to William, and a look of realization passed over his face. He took a step back, his expression a mix of betrayal and disbelief. "Oh my God," Matt muttered, shaking his head. "I knew it." "Matt, please," Jessica pleaded, reaching out toward him, but he jerked away from her touch. "Don't!" he snapped, his voice shaking. "Don't try to explain this. I don't want to hear it. Let's just calm down," William said, stepping forward, but Matt cut him off with a sharp glare. "Stay away from me," Matt hissed, his fists clenched at his sides. "You've already done enough." William took a step back, clearly trying to defuse the situation, but Matt wasn't having it. He turned on his heel and stormed down the hallway, leaving Jessica and William standing there in the thick silence. Jessica's heart was pounding in her chest, her hands shaking. She had been afraid of this moment for weeks, but now that it had arrived, it felt worse than she could have imagined. "We should have stopped this," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "We should have known it would come to this." William looked at her, his face tense. "It's not over yet." The following day, Matt didn't come home. Jessica's phone rang constantly with calls from his friends, asking if she knew where he was, but she had no answers. Her heart sank deeper with each hour that passed, the weight of her decisions crushing her with guilt. By the time evening came, Jessica was a wreck. She had called Peter at the office, telling him she was worried about Matt, but leaving out the real reason why. Peter, oblivious to the chaos unraveling at home, told her he would come back as soon as he could. But Jessica knew even his presence wouldn't fix what had been broken. When Matt finally did come home, it was late. Jessica was sitting in the darkened living room when she heard the door creak open. She stood up quickly, rushing toward him. "Matt," she said, her voice filled with relief. "Where have you been?" I've been worried sick. But Matt brushed past her, his face cold. Don't act like you care, he muttered, heading for the stairs. Jessica's heart sank. Matt, please, we need to talk about this. I don't want to talk, Matt shot back, his voice sharp. Not to you, not to him. Jessica reached out, grabbing his arm. We have to fix this. We can't go on like this. Matt yanked his arm free, his eyes blazing with anger. Fix this? How do you expect to fix this, Mom? You've ruined everything. Tears welled in Jessica's eyes as she watched her son's face twist with pain. She had broken his trust, shattered the family she had worked so hard to hold together. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Jessica whispered, her voice cracking. I never wanted to hurt you or your father. Matt's expression softened slightly, but his anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. He shook his head, turning away from her. I'm going to bed, he muttered, walking away without another word. Jessica watched him go, her heart breaking. She had lost her son, and there was nothing she could do to get him back. Jessica couldn't stop thinking about Matt's fury when he had confronted her. The look of betrayal in his eyes haunted her, and although Matt hadn't brought it up again, his cold, clipped responses whenever he spoke to her told her all she needed to know. Their relationship was broken. One evening, Peter was away on another business trip, and Jessica found herself alone with Matt and William in the house. She knew it couldn't go on like this, but she had no idea how to fix it. Every attempt she made to talk to Matt was met with silence or cold, one-word responses. William, for his part, acted as though nothing had changed, going about his day like the affair hadn't left cracks in the foundation of their lives. Jessica sat in the living room, staring out the window at the fading daylight, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Matt standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Matt, we need to talk, Jessica said quietly, standing up from the couch. I don't think there's anything left to say, Matt replied, his voice flat. Please, Jessica pleaded, stepping toward him. We can't keep living like this. I know I've hurt you and I wish I could take it back, but we have to figure out a way to move forward. Matt looked at her for a long moment, his face hard, before he finally spoke. How do you expect us to move forward, Mom? After what you did? Jessica swallowed hard, her chest tightening with guilt. I don't know, she admitted. But I'm still your mother. I'm still here. And I want to fix this. Before Matt could respond, they both heard footsteps coming down the stairs. William entered the room, glancing between the two of them, sensing the tension in the air. What's going on? William asked, his voice calm but wary. Matt's jaw clenched, and Jessica could see the anger flashing in his eyes again. The sight of William only seemed to fuel the fire that had been simmering in Matt for days. We were just talking, Jessica said quickly, trying to defuse the situation. Talking about what? William asked, his tone sharpening as he looked at Matt. About me? Matt took a step toward William, his fists clenched at his sides. What do you think? He spat, his voice low and dangerous. You've ruined everything. Matt? Jessica warned, her voice trembling. Please don't do this. But Matt ignored her, his eyes locked on William. I trusted you. I look up to you like a brother. And this is how you repay me? William remained calm, his gaze steady as he faced Matt. You don't understand, Matt. This isn't as simple as you think. It's exactly as simple as I think, Matt shot back, his voice rising. You betrayed us. You betrayed me. Jessica could see the confrontation spiraling out of control, the tension between the two of them escalating rapidly. She stepped between them, placing a hand on Matt's arm, but he shook her off. Don't touch me, Matt snapped, his voice filled with anger. You're just as bad as he is. Jessica recoiled, her heart breaking at the coldness in Matt's words. She had never felt so helpless, so trapped by the consequences of her own actions. The family she had tried so hard to hold together was unraveling before her eyes. William, sensing that things were about to explode, took a step back. Matt, let's just calm down. This isn't going to solve anything. But Matt wasn't listening. His fury had reached a boiling point, and it was clear he was beyond reasoning. You're not going to talk your way out of this. Matt hissed, his fists shaking with barely contained rage. "You've destroyed our family, and you're going to pay for it." Jessica's heart raced, panic rising in her chest. She could see where this was heading, and she needed to stop it before it was too late. "Matt, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't do this." But Matt had already made up his mind. With a sudden, violent motion, he lunged at William, shoving him hard against the wall. The force of the impact knocked the air out of William's lungs, and he struggled to regain his balance. "Stop!" Jessica screamed, rushing toward them, but Matt was too strong, too consumed by his anger. William tried to push Matt off, but Matt was relentless. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Matt growled, his voice trembling with fury. "You think you can ruin everything and get away with it?" "Matt, stop!" Jessica cried, grabbing his arm, but he shoved her aside, his eyes never leaving William. William's back hit the wall again, and Jessica watched in horror as Matt's hand closed around his throat. William gasped, struggling to breathe, his eyes wide with shock. Jessica could barely move, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. "Matt, don't!" Jessica screamed, rushing toward him again, but this time, she was too late. With one final push, Matt shoved William backward with all his strength. William's head struck the corner of the mantel with a sickening crack, the sound echoing through the room. His body crumpled to the floor, motionless. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The only sound in the room was Jessica's ragged breathing, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared down at William's lifeless body, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Matt stood frozen, his face pale, his chest heaving as he stared at William's body in shock. I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice trembling. Jessica dropped to her knees beside William, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch him. There was blood pooling beneath his head, staining the floor, and his eyes were closed, his chest still. "Oh my God," Jessica sobbed, her hands trembling as she pressed them to William's chest. But there was no pulse, no sign of life. "Oh my God, what have we done?" Matt took a step back, his face white as a sheet. "It was an accident," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to." Jessica's mind raced, panic flooding her system. She could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her, suffocating her. Her son had just killed her lover, her stepson, and there was no going back. "We need to call someone," Matt said, his voice shaking as he stared down at William's body. Jessica shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "No," she said firmly, standing up slowly. "We can't." Matt looked at her, his face filled with confusion and fear. "What?" "Mom, we have to." Jessica's hands trembled as she stepped toward him. "If we call someone, they'll take you away. They'll say it wasn't an accident." "But it was an accident," Matt shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "I didn't mean to kill him." Jessica reached out, grabbing Matt's hands in hers, squeezing them tightly. "I know, but they won't see it that way. They'll say you did it on purpose, and they'll take you away. I can't lose you, Matt." Matt stared at her, his eyes wide with fear. "What are we going to do?" Jessica swallowed hard, her mind racing as she tried to come up with a plan. "We'll say he left," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That he ran off. No one has to know." Matt looked down at William's body, his face pale with disbelief. "We can't just hide this." "We don't have a choice," Jessica said, her voice shaking with determination. "We have to protect you." Matt's face crumpled with guilt, but he nodded slowly, his hands still trembling in hers. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Okay." The next few days were a blur. Jessica and Matt told Peter that William had left suddenly, claiming he needed to get away for a while. Peter, consumed with work, didn't ask too many questions, though Jessica could see the worry in his eyes. Matt withdrew further into himself, consumed by guilt, while Jessica lived with the constant fear that their secret would be discovered. Every knock at the door, every unexpected phone call sent her heart racing, terrified that their lies would come crashing down around them. In the end, the murder didn't just take William's life. It destroyed what was left of their family. The secret they buried consumed them, and though no one ever found William's body, the truth hung over them like a dark cloud, threatening to break them apart. Jessica knew that the lie they had woven could not hold forever. Every day felt like an eternity as she waited for the truth to catch up with them. Matt had become a shadow of himself. He rarely spoke, barely left the house, and when he did, he was distant, lost in his thoughts. Jessica's heart broke every time she looked at him. Her son, who had been pulled into her terrible mistakes, was now burdened with a guilt no one should bear. Peter, meanwhile, was growing suspicious. William's sudden disappearance weighed on him, and Jessica could see the worry etched into his features. He asked more questions, where William might have gone if anyone had heard from him. But Jessica stuck to the story they had concocted, telling him over and over that William had needed space, that he had left of his own accord. But even she could see that Peter wasn't buying it anymore. The cracks were starting to show. One evening, as Jessica sat alone in the living room, Peter walked in, his expression grim. He had been quiet for days, but now she could see that he was ready to confront what he had been holding back. "We need to talk," Peter said, his voice tight. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She had been dreading this conversation, knowing it was only a matter of time before Peter's suspicions became too great to ignore. "About what?" Jessica asked, trying to sound calm, though her voice wavered. "About William," Peter said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "Something's not right, Jessica. He wouldn't just leave like this, without saying anything to me, and it's been too long without any word from him." Jessica swallowed hard, her mind racing as she tried to think of how to respond. "I told you, Peter. He needed space. He was feeling overwhelmed and—" Peter cut her off, his voice sharp. "Jessica, stop. I know something's wrong, and I need to know the truth." Jessica felt the panic rising in her chest. The lie was unraveling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She had hoped, prayed, that they could keep this secret buried, but now it was clear that the truth was coming for them. Before she could say anything, Matt appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He had been listening. He always knew when things were about to boil over. "Dad." Matt's voice trembled as he stepped into the room. "I need to tell you something." Jessica's heart sank. This was it. She could see the look of devastation in Matt's eyes, the guilt he had been carrying for so long finally ready to spill out. She wanted to stop him, to protect him from what was about to happen, but there was no turning back now. Peter looked at Matt, confusion and concern etched across his face. "What is it, Matt?" Matt swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. "It's about William." Peter's brow furrowed. "What about him?" Jessica stood frozen, unable to speak as Matt took a deep breath, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. "I killed him." The words hung in the air like a bomb exploding between them. Peter's face went pale, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Matt's shoulders slumped, tears welling up in his eyes. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to. We were arguing, and I pushed him. He hit his head, and he didn't get up." Jessica felt her legs weaken, her vision blurring as the room seemed to spin around her. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud, hearing Matt confess to Peter, was more than she could bear. Peter staggered back, his hand covering his mouth as he tried to process what he had just heard. No, this can't be. "William is dead?" Matt nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Dad, I'm so sorry." Peter turned to Jessica, his eyes filled with anguish and betrayal. "You knew?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "You knew? And you didn't tell me?" Jessica's chest tightened, guilt overwhelming her as she nodded. I was trying to protect him," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to lose him too." Peter stared at her, his face contorted with a mix of grief and fury. "You lied to me. Both of you." "I didn't know what else to do," Jessica said, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't lose Matt. I couldn't let him go to prison." Peter shook his head. backing away from them as though he couldn't bear to be near them. "You've destroyed everything." In the aftermath of the confession, the Palmer family was shattered beyond repair. Peter left, unable to face the betrayal. Matt was arrested, though the courts acknowledged William's death as accidental. Despite a lenient sentence, the weight of guilt followed him daily. Jessica, left alone with the ruins of her choices, faced the haunting consequences of the affair. Estranged from her husband and son, she carried the burden of the secrets that tore her family apart. In the end, William's death was a grim reminder. Some actions, once taken, can never be undone.